So let's talk about history. Why do we study history? Why is it so important for children who love Yeshua and walk in his Torah and have a whole Bible outlook? Why is it so important that they grow up to really understand history? Well, history is super important because as we observe the actions of people in the past, we understand the God that they follow. And a lot of times, almost all the time, of course, that's following an idol or a false god or themselves, humanism. And so as we observe their actions and we see how things turned out for them, or turned out badly usually, then we want our children to not repeat those things. It helps us to have living examples, as it says, as we talked earlier in this conference, about Hebrews chapter 12, seeing as we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses. This crowd of witnesses is also part of our history. Now, another thing I love about history is that we should know what God, our Creator, thinks is important. How should civilizations act? How does he think that the whole thing is going to play out? Who are his special people? You know, we read in Genesis chapter 10 that there are 70 nations that are scattered all around the earth, and he told them to scatter. He told them to spread out and fill the whole earth. And then there is also one special people that descend from Abraham, also from Isaac and Jacob. And those people are known in history as Israel. And for them, he set up a government, and he set up a culture and a temple and a manner of worship and a way of treating our neighbors and a law code and a legal system and a justice system and so on. And as he sets those things up, he invites us to join with those people if we'd like to. Now, many nations just use the law code known as the Torah as their template for setting up their own constitutions. In our house, we like to say, no, we would actually just want to join those people. Those people of God known as Israel, those are our people. That's going to be our family. Their God is going to be our God. And so as we study history, we want to focus always on who is being worshipped and how did that affect their actions, and what is God's great and mighty plan for all of history. In fact, when we look at history, we can get a sense of where he's going to go in the future and what's going to happen, and it's all contained in the Word of God. So, as we teach history, there are some things that we want to include, not only from a biblical perspective, also from our government's perspective, and they're going to expect you as a homeschooling mom to include certain things in your day, okay? And if you don't, they're going to say you're not actually homeschooling and educating your children. See, this is why we hate homeschoolers. So we want to include several things. First of all, we want to include geography. Now, we do have a geography curriculum at Homeschooling Torah, and every single week there's a topic, a place in the world that we study. And throughout the 36 weeks, you've gone through the entire world. And we like to have an emphasis on prayer. We talk about those countries, and then there's lots of activities. We make maps. And so you're going to learn a lot about the culture, the language, the religion, and how we can pray for those people. What needs they have, what's their economy, what do they grow, what do they export and import, and where are they in the world, what's their capital city. So these are important things. We don't have to just have a 36-week class on geography. We can also learn geography, and should, every year that we do history. So in our home, we like to do maps at least once a week, that we are doing a map and understanding where the historical event that we're talking about took place. And over the years of learning history, from ancient history all the way up to modern times, it helps us to get a sense of everything that took place in that part of the world. Now, we want to also include anthropology, and that is the study of man, or the study of the cultures and that are in that area, in that time period, and in that area of the world. We also want to study the governments of the world. We want to study, how do governments function? Are governments ordained by God? Yes. And how do they function over time? Which ones were run according to his Torah, his godly principles, and which ones were not? And so we're going to look at those over time and in local places today all around the world. We want to have timelines so that we understand how everything fits into the 6,000 or so years that have happened since creation. We want those timelines to be biblical. The Bible is the only thing that gives us a true history of the world, and it is incredibly important that we make sure our timelines are accurate. I feel this weight pretty heavily because I have a lot of books that include timelines of especially ancient history, and these are godly men and women who love His Word, and yet they disagree on their timelines. And oh my goodness, that bugs me, because in the curriculum we have included timelines, and we've told you this is the accurate date, and then we'll get a new book in from some great historian that we really respect, who is alive right now and checking out archaeology in Israel and so on, and well, it'll be different by 70, 80 years, or sometimes 200 or 300 years, or worse, by 500 years or more. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, because I don't want to teach children wrong. I don't want them to be learning something that's inaccurate. So in fact, we have a big project going on right now where in our home we are checking all these different timelines. But I'll be honest with you, if you really push someone, they aren't even sure what year Yeshua was born and what year he died. We can kind of estimate it's between maybe 28 AD to 33 AD ish. We think it's there, and that messes with my head. Part of the reason we don't know for sure is because calendars have changed over time, and as calendars switch from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, and that's just one of many switches. It used to be that every single country had their own calendar, so you have to compare, and you have to take astrological dates. When was there a lunar eclipse? When did this, constellation appear in the sky? And then they're mentioned in political documents and so on from the 1st century or even earlier. And so you have to take all of these things and combine them together and compare everything. And I have a hard time with this because I'm a very black and white person, and I like everything to match up. Having said that, we can teach our children that these are all godly people, and they really are trying to make sure what they teach is according to His Word. They understand that they are teaching children, and it's super important for them to be accurate. But it is sometimes not possible with the limited amount of understanding that we have here at the end of the centuries, so far removed from the things that happened. We have to depend on the eyewitness accounts of people who wrote things down. We have to depend on them being accurate and true. And sometimes it's like a big puzzle piece, and we're doing our best. And as we find things that are in error, we will update and let people know. But I think you could just teach your children that these timelines must match the Word of God. And it's really easy to go out into the secular historians' timelines, go to a local museum, a field museum or whatever, and notice that their dates don't match the ones you learned in history. See if your kids can pick that up and say, wait, is that because we're wrong? Usually not. Usually they are intentionally trying to make sure their dates don't line up with the Bible, because they have an agenda of making sure that the Bible is always considered foolish and ignorant and inaccurate. And we need to teach our children that no, it's exactly the opposite. This Bible is incredibly accurate, and we can know truth. And at least, even if we're only 70 years or even 2 or 3 years off the truth, we're so much more accurate than those that are centuries and centuries off. Okay, wow, I got off on my soapbox there. We need to learn about major wars that happened in the world, and how that affected the populations that lived there. We need to know the Bible's storyline, which is Israel. We need to know Israel's history. It is our history if we have joined ourselves to God and His people. We need to know, where do we fit in His big plan? We've got, in the Old Testament, we're going to be studying ancient history. And the Old Testament, we have a lot of that in the Bible. So we can be sure that we know where we fit in God's plan, because it tells us. And so we're going to learn everything from when He created the world until this book is when the people of God, His people, Israel, were taken off into captivity to Assyria. So this would be the 10 northern tribes. And this book covers all of that. And then we know, because the Bible tells us, what happened to the peoples that lived after that. And hopefully you can see this with the sun glare. This is Daniel's statue that he saw with the head of gold, and then silver, and then bronze, and then iron. And we learn that this is Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And these were what the Father considers the 4 main empires that ever existed. And we learn how those affect what we live like today, and how even our buildings are built. I love to go to museums this year and see things like that. We also learn that we're still very much in a Greek and Roman culture, and probably a Babylonian and Persian culture too, and we just don't notice that in the culture around us. So that one takes us up from the Babylonian captivity. Actually, it starts really back at history, or at creation, with the story of Nimrod and Babel. So it skips forward in time then to Persia, which Babylon and Persia were in control when the southern kingdoms of Israel were taken into captivity. And then we also go back to the beginning of Greece and Rome and catch them back up, and then find out about the Greek empires. This would be the time of the Maccabees, and we learn about this at Hanukkah. And then we have the Roman Empire. This is where Yeshua was born, and the Roman Empire started a little before him and continued on. But this book here takes you up to about the 1st century. Then we need to study and continue on in history, because we're only at the 1st century, and here we are 1900 years later, and surely the Bible has something to say about that, right? Doesn't the Bible just get silent and we know nothing about our own time? Does God have nothing to say about our time in history? And if you know me at all, you know I don't believe that. You know I believe that the Bible does give, it was then prophecy, but prophecy that foretold what would happen after Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. And so in this book we talk about that, and we use the book of Revelation as a look at history from the time of about 96 AD until the time of Yeshua's return. So this is going to take us 2 history books to do. So this one here, Seals and Trumpets, just does the Middle Ages, the seals and the trumpets that are listed in the Revelation, and it covers up to about the time of the invention of the printing press. And then book 4 goes all the way from the printing press to modern times, and also talks about how the nation of Israel was regathered and is being regathered and will be continuing to be regathered. So those are really important. Now, we also have, for those of us that live in the United States, we are required by government in most of the states to teach American history. And so we looked at what the Bible says about America, which frankly wasn't that much, not enough to cover a whole year, but we incorporate those Bible verses into the parts of history for our country. And we also emphasize good character. So we learn about lending, and we learn about people that mistreat others. And we memorize verses often from Proverbs, and that teach us about how we are to treat others and how we are to live in a civilization. And so that book will talk a lot about that as well. So in all of our curriculum, there is a basic format that we use, and it has an overview map every single week. Overview map, that's not really the right word. We have an overview chart that helps you prepare. What books do you need? So this book is just going to help you by scheduling everything, but you're going to need to have additional books. We have lists of those additional books on our website. Some of them are required, and they're scheduled pretty much every day, and some of them are optional, and I really like to go to my local library. So for instance, this one has 3 optional books. It has your Bible, because that's very optional. It has Genesis, Finding Our Roots, and the Story of the Ancient World. So those are the 3 spines, as we like to call them, that the book depends on and hangs on. And then it also has a little bit of warning that coming up in 2 weeks, you're going to have this book called Joseph that is optional, but if you don't own it and you weren't intending to buy it, you need to go ahead and contact your local librarian and get that ordered. So some of the things that happen, I should say also, we have a high school supplement, so that the high school students are doing more reading than what is done together as a group. And so they're going to read about 40-some pages from a book by Henry Morris, and that will really help them in their worldview too. So we start out every day by reading, and this week the mom is going to read 5 pages that morning, and it's not a hard 5 pages. They're very conversational, the story from the story of the world, and then there are discussion questions. So as in everything, if your children are not used to listening aloud and hearing the answers, you're going to want to kind of peek at those discussion questions, and you're going to want to pay attention. So for instance, what 3 evil practices did the Sumerians do? What is another name for Nimrod? And what does mean? And what is a Chaldean? So as you're reading aloud, when you get to the part about the evil practices that the Sumerians do, then you're going to maybe want to stop and ask your kids that question. It also says read Deuteronomy 18, and so you could stop right there and read it and then discuss it and then keep going in the reading. Now that's for kids that don't have an attention span. If you do have an attention span and they're used to hearing you read aloud, then you could read the whole section and then go over those questions. Then after that, what we do is we have a little time where we memorize a Bible verse. Again, just like in our Bible classes, we have memory verses every single week for history. This week we are learning Genesis 12. Actually, it says they're going to learn it over 2 weeks. They're going to learn some verses from Genesis 12. And so you're going to go over them using the same techniques that you would use for Bible time to memorize a verse, repeating it, copying it, and so on. And then there's a timeline. You're going to add when Abraham's father Terah was born, which was, we're estimating 2126 BC, and you're going to add that to your timeline. So a timeline is so handy. You could have 2 different kinds of timelines. If you live in a house for a long time, you don't expect to be moving, you have a dedicated school spot, then you might want to put up a timeline up on the wall. You're going to need a good amount of space for this. Some people have that. I don't find that most families do, though. Most families prefer to make a book, a timeline book, and we bought ours way back when my son was 5 years old from Sunlight Curriculum, and it's the same one we've been using ever since. I have some others that are fantastic, just as good, or you can just make your own, and it's basically a line with a slash mark for important dates, and you probably want a little bit more space as you get up into modern times because we just have more records and you're going to have more things to fill in on each date. As you get into ancient times, you could go a long time between knowing anything that happened then, so you don't necessarily need quite as many pages for the ancient history. So you're going to make sure you put some things on the timeline. Now, we have recommended some timeline pictures that you can purchase and cut out and paste in your timeline book, but if you don't want to spend the money on that, it's a simple Google search. I prefer Wikipedia. Just go to Wikipedia, type in Terah. Oh, this might be more difficult because it's a Bible character, so you might even be able to go to a Bible clip art place and get a clip art picture of Terah and somehow draw a picture. If all else fails, a stick figure works, and label him with his name and put the dates. So as the week continues, the next week you're going to be reading from Genesis, Finding Our Roots, and discussing a little bit about the history and the stars. As the week continues, you're also going to have some maps. So you're going to have a map of where Abraham traveled, and so that you know where Ur of the Chaldees is and where Canaan is, and he's going to travel, and so you definitely need a map of that one. For maps, I really like having tracing paper. Tracing paper is a little bit lighter weight than your normal copy paper or printer paper. You can get it on Amazon. It's not expensive, but you can put it over a map in a book and see enough through it that you can trace it. Now, you could print a map. I'm sure any Google search would find pretty much any map you need, and you could print it. We have recommended map books and stuff that we recommend that you have for your home library, but something about tracing it. My husband used to say this years and years ago. He was a history teacher at a public school, and he was saying that tracing it helps you memorize the map so much better than just coloring in a pre-made map. So because of that, he requested that for our children, we make them trace maps. So except in extremely busy times, my kids are tracing their maps and then having to color and label. If we're really busy, maybe we don't color, maybe we just label, but the tracing part is really important. And I feel like our kids really do have a good grasp on geography. So I think my husband was right on that one. Getting more senses involved, the more ways you interact with something, the better you learn it, right? So that was 3 days of reading. Day 1, day 2, and day 3, we read from those books. And then on day 4 and 5, most of the time, across all of our history curriculum, we don't have more reading. There are a couple exceptions, but truly, my goal was for mom who has to make a grocery list and has to go run errands and go to dentist appointments and get ready for Sabbath. My intention was for her to be able to give assignments to her children on those days. So 3 days of reading, 2 days of assignments that they can do on their own, and you don't have to do them in that order. You could mix it up a little bit so that you're always reading on a certain specific 3 days, and you always use another day to schedule all your doctor appointments, and you have a Sabbath prep day. And you don't have to do it that way, but that's one of the reasons why we designed it in this way. So in this specific week we've been talking about, they're going to recite their memory work that they've learned so far, because reviewing what you've learned over the entire school year is really important to keep it in your long-term memory. They're going to, in their best handwriting, copy Genesis 12:1, which was their memory verse, into their notebook. And so a notebook is just in their 3-ring binder. You're going to have a piece of notebook paper that in their best handwriting, they copy that memory verse. And over the school, you're going to add more and more memory verses to that. And that's their own record, and that copying is very important to help them memorize it. Then it says, occupations to research and report about. Language translation and Bible translation. So they're going to learn about those occupations that day. And to do that, they're probably going to need the internet or their local library. So if you don't have the ability to go to the library every single week, then use the amazing internet that is at our fingertips. If you don't want your children to do that on their own, maybe then you can use some of the websites that we recommend and just give them to them to look at. Or you can sit with them and do some more digging, find some YouTubes and so on. Once in a while we have worksheets that they can do. So for this week, this is their worksheet, and they have to define some things and list who lived at these time periods, and it's just another way to review what they have already been learning. I would recommend, as you go through history, that you also keep an eye out for artwork and music that happened at that time period, that you dive in a little bit to some of the artwork. So if you're learning about ancient Sumerian cultures, you can find out lots of books have information about the artwork that was happening at that time period. Maybe you could find some ancient musical instruments that were being invented and see what those sound like. Again, this takes a little bit of digging, but it's really fun. Sometimes I add these kind of tasks to my morning basket and do it at Together School Time. And other times I add them to a list of possible field trips, or a day that we're just not feeling great. We're all under the weather from a cold. We'll plop on the couch, we'll get up YouTube on our TV, and all together we'll be looking for some of these topics, and we'll just watch a bunch of videos. Field trips are super important, so pay attention to what is available in your area. I know you can do virtual field trips where you can go online and see really big museums, say in Chicago or New York City, and they offer a virtual field trip. But if you can get there yourself, it's so much better. So before the school year starts, maybe find out what are some local attractions that would kind of fit into history, and write them on a sticky note and put them in your book right about where it's going to happen. So you can look at the table of contents in the front, and you can find out when you're going to be studying Egypt, for instance. It's going to be week 25, and then you can get out that calendar that you've already made yourself for your school year, and you can find out about when week 25 will be, and then schedule a field trip for that time, and that will really make history come alive. As you get into American history or modern history, you could interview people that lived through, say, World War II. It's getting harder and harder to interview people for that time period, but or anything since then. Recently, my kids all interviewed their grandmother and asked her questions about what life was like in the 1950s, and so that was really fun. So interviewing real life people is probably the best thing you can do. When you're done interviewing, have your kids make a notebooking page where they tell what they learned, as much as possible putting into the words of the person they interviewed what they learned, so that we're recording those little bits of history. So how busy is mom going to be if she does all of this history? Well, my intention, by the time you've read through those 5 or 6 pages that you have every day, you've had a couple discussions, you've reviewed your memory verses, and you've put new things in your timelines. You can assign this timeline, by the way, to your kids to do on their own time. Just check it the next day. They're going to do on their maps on their own time. They can make notebooking pages on their own time. Generally speaking, 30 minutes would probably be enough for history. Anything beyond that, and your kids are going to start to see their eyes glaze over, and they're just not going to be able to remember what you've learned. So I schedule 30 minutes, again, like any other subject. If you have a crazy day where you're so into that topic and it gets going into 45 minutes or more, then that's okay, but don't let that be a habit. Try to keep these lessons shorter so that you have everyone's interest, and I really think that would be the wisest thing to do. If you can't get it done, ask yourself where you're getting off track. How do you get going? Like, where do you get on your soapbox? I'm pretty sure that's probably where it's going to be. So I hope this helps you as you figure out history for your kids. It doesn't have to be terribly long, but it is important to understand what the Father is doing in our world and in time and culture and in place. It is important for our children to be able to interact with our world around us and to be intelligent about what has happened. I find that when children have a good understanding of history, they often have a good understanding of many, many other things in their lives. So history is very, very important.